Right after. Good choice.
It's okay if you don't.
All his teachers.
Okay, we're live, Dave.
Okay, all right. Well, I'd like to, we'll excuse our mayor tonight, who's had some other commitments, but I'd like to welcome everyone to our joint city council and planning commission work session this evening. And we have some good things to discuss tonight regarding our land development code amendments. And so I will go ahead and turn the time over to Mike.
Okay, so I just want to introduce Lydia Ness and Jamin Kimball from Cascadia Partners, and they prepared our Goal 9 economic opportunities analysis a couple years back anyway, which we then used for our Goal 14 stuff, right?
Housing production strategy.
Housing production strategy, sorry about that. But anyway, so they're very familiar with our community, and so as we've kind of have chatted in the past anyway, over the last 10 or more years, there's been a huge push in housing code changes at the state level through a variety of House bills and Senate bills, and then there's all kinds of little stuff going off on the side that seem to get folded in, and we get mandated requirements to update our codes. And so you've seen a number of those come through through the council meetings to get adopted. But because there was so many, I had an opportunity to apply for technical assistance from the Department of Land Conservation and Development to do a code audit to see how much did I miss? You know, how out of compliance are we? Because there's so many changes that I was certain that we missed something. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, and we've missed a few. So what you'll see in your presentation tonight is you'll see, you know, a number of code changes that are required that where we're out of compliance, not in a necessarily a bad way, but it's out of compliance, and we just need to do a code change to get ourselves consistent with state law. And then there's a number of changes that are just a practice of how you administer stuff in creating clear and objective standards, so that when an applicant looks at your code standard, they don't have to ask you for an interpretation. It's pretty obvious. Either you meet it or you don't, so at least they can anticipate whether or not they're going to be successful with their application, or what do they need to update or change in their application to have a reasonable submittal. So those are predominantly what you'll see, and so Jamin, are you doing the presentation?
Yep,
yeah. So
kick it off. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jamin will kind of go through, and then we'll ask questions as you go or whatever, and Jamin can kind of let you know the best timing for that. And with that, go ahead.
Great. Yep. Good evening, commissioners, councilors. Thank you for having us here. So, Jamin Kimball, I'm a partner at Cascadia Partners, principal in charge for the project, and so we do a variety of these kinds of housing planning and code work for communities across the state. Yeah, so looking forward to digging in. I think.
Is that working?
No. Is it on?
Let me see real quick if I messed you up. I did something screwy here. I'll find my mouse. There we go.
Okay. So we have a quick presentation, or we have a presentation that helps sort of facilitate the discussion today. We want this to, the primary purpose of this meeting was for you all to be able to ask us questions and get more context about why these amendments are necessary, what choices you might have in becoming compliant with state law. Sometimes it's very clear and straightforward. Other times there's some choices to be made about how you comply. And so we want this to be conversational, and you would give a chance to give us some input, so we can take that and make some final changes to these and hand that off to Michael, so he has amendments that are ready to come to you that you've already seen and you feel comfortable with for a public hearing at some point in the future. So I'm going to spend about probably 5 minutes just going over the background, and then going into sort of one of the more significant changes, and then we'll pause there for some questions, and then Lydia will take us through a few of the other additional changes. So Michael provided the basic background for you, but the gist of it is that the state legislature has been very busy in the last probably 5 to 10 years on housing-related legislation. They are busy today still, getting notifications about other housing-related bills that are passing and may also impact the development code in the future, and we can talk about how that relates to this effort. But it's a bit of a moving target. I think Michael's kept the code as up to date as possible, but there's a lot to keep track of, and so that is also why the state has allocated funding to help cities to keep their codes up to date with what the statutes require. And so our project included both an audit of the code in the first phase, and then preparing the draft amendments that are in your packet today. And so we did do a comprehensive audit of the code. When we did that, we looked for, generally, we have a set of housing-related statutes that have been passed in the last, I would say, 10 years, but some of them go back further. And that's our scope of what we're looking for when we're auditing the code. So I don't know how many there are, but there's a couple dozen probably different statutes that have been either enacted or amended in those over that time frame. One of them I wanted to point out in particular that's more consequential is the requirement for cities to have clear and objective standards, conditions and procedures for needed housing. It's the specific terms in the statute. So you'll see a number of amendments in the packet there, and they're color-coded blue. Those are easy to separate to understand why those are there. That's a requirement that applies to, Lydia will touch on this more, all housing development essentially. Is a requirement that an applicant have before them for any place where housing is a permitted use in your zoning code, that they have a clear and objective approval pathway. So they have a way to get approved, but they don't need to be subject to any rules that are discretionary, require interpretation, etc. And so just wanted to point that out, as you'll see that there's amendments sort of spread throughout multiple sections. There we talk about why that was necessary in some of those specific cases. Okay, let's go into the specific overview. So we have sort of a slide giving you a summary of the topic and the statute and what the code amendments that are in your packet. And then we'll pause and give you a chance to ask questions, see if there need any clarification about that. We can look at specific language in the packet if you have questions about it. So this first one is on subdivisions and limited land use decisions. So this one gets a little bit wonky in the land use legal world here. So under state law, subdivision preliminary plats, so the final plat is a separate process, and that's not affected by this change. So when a subdivision goes through a process, it does a preliminary plat, and then they get that approved. They go there for their final plat later. The final plat is largely making sure that it's consistent with what was approved initially. But the preliminary plat is really the stage at which the subdivision is, the substance of the proposal is reviewed and approved.
Yes, let me catch her there. So this is so true construction subdivision that you've seen recently is this scenario where the Planning Commission has historically done the preliminary plat, then made a recommendation ultimately, once it's constructed, for you to approve the final plat. So that's what you've seen in the past. So in the context of historical, that's what we're dealing with, and then Jamie can kind of tell you the direction we're going.
And you're talking about the one on 16th, off the 16th?
Yeah, so that's just an example of a recent one.
Okay.
Yeah. But a subdivision can be anything from three lots, is that?
4 or more.
Four more. Four lots up to 200 lots. Any application for a subdivision could be a variety of different sizes. Under state law, those are classified as a limited land use decision, and there's a sort of a set of a procedure around what kind of requirements a city is allowed to apply to decisions that are a limited land use decision. And those are essentially what we would call an administrative review process. And so the decider is usually the city staff, There is written notice provided to everyone within 100 feet of the subject property. And those people who receive notice or others can comment on, provide written comments to the city staff. The city staff makes a decision, approve or deny, establishes conditions of approval, and that's the process. So Michael, I'm sure, does this every day, right? Today, subdivisions in the LeGrand Development Code are subject to the Planning Commission review procedure, which means you go through a public hearing, and the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to approve or deny. And so that procedure would be classified under state law as a quasi-judicial review procedure, which is separate from, it goes above and beyond a limited litigants decision, which is an administrative procedure. So a lot of terms there, but basically the idea is that the city can no longer apply a quasi-judicial planning commission hearing process to subdivision applications. And so those applications will go through the Community Development Director review procedure as it's outlined in the Land Development Code, and no longer come directly to the Planning Commission. With the caveat that any decision that's made by the Community Development Director can be appealed to the Planning Commission. And so there is a recourse if there is a project that someone is concerned about, its impacts that weren't taken into account, then it can be appealed to the Planning Commission. Okay, I think I covered everything there. So more consequential change in that large project will not come to the Planning Commission for approval in the future and go through a public hearing process. Larger subdivisions.
And that's
The
just
idea-
preliminary though, right?
The idea is that
Yes.
we've set it up, so our planning director, there's boxes to check. If they check all the boxes, it's approved. If they don't, then it's not. So you don't really need the
Yes, yeah.
quasi-judicial.
Exactly. The quasi-judicial is supposed to be for decisions that are discretionary in nature, that require some judgment and policy decisions. This is related to the push for clear and objective standards. So if you have clear and objective standards in your code, then it can be decided administratively because there isn't a lot of discretion. The rules are all clear. So separate from if you were to establish a new, or you rezone a property, you're changing the rules that apply to that property. That is a quasi-judicial or legislative decision and not administrative by staff. It's really allowing a subdivision under the existing rules to consider a living relationship.
Make it simpler.
It will make it simpler and faster in some ways for a developer. Yeah.
The final plat will still be reviewed by city council, that doesn't change.
But
That
at
makes
that
a lot of
point,
sense.
At that
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
yeah.
Streamline it till you get to that final bit.
Yeah, so I think the only piece that'll just be an experiment, we'll just have to see as we kind of learn what this looks like from an administrative level. I think the smaller subdivisions that we've been seeing aren't gonna be a big deal. But when we get a fairly large one that comes in that generates a lot of controversy with neighbors, that's gonna be interesting when the limit of their involvement is they get to submit a letter in writing, this, you know, of what their concerns are. And there's really not much we can do with that, you know, at the administrative level, because either they meet the standard or they don't.
They don't.
And whereas right now, those types of applications go to the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission will look at the impacts that potentially are allegedly, you know, going to occur, and then they can impose conditions of approval to mitigate those. I'd still be able to do that, but it's gonna be at a different level. You know, and so you're very likely, you're not gonna be sitting here having a negotiation between the applicant and the folks that have an impact or an alleged impact, and trying to figure out, is this improvement, if we build a fence, will that make you happy? You know, so you're not gonna get any of that, so you're very likely not gonna see, unless it's a really obvious impact that requires a mitigation element, you're very likely not gonna see that as a condition of approval. They would need to go through an appeal process in order to deal with that level of a request for a mitigation issue. But I'm not anticipating it being that big a deal. Most of the subdivisions that have come through have been fairly straightforward with very minimal controversy. And the controversy that we generally see is the neighbor just doesn't want to see the subdivision at all, because they like the field right there next door across the street. So That's generally what we see. So I think this, for the most part, is gonna be nice, but the development that we had a work session on, a month or two ago, will be an interesting one if that moves forward, because that's, I don't know if it's 180 something lots or if it was 280 something, it was a lot. That's gonna be a really big administrative decision. That'll probably be the biggest one I've ever made in my career here, if that comes through. So that's gonna be interesting.
Have fun, Mike.
Yeah,
Mike, who does the letter go to? Does it go to you?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And there's, I mean, sometimes there's obvious things in there where there's obvious impacts and we can do a condition of approval to address things that are minor, but sometimes people ask for pretty big stuff.
And for the final approval, I would assume that those letters would be included in a packet that the council would review.
Maybe. So the way the preliminary plat works is they go through a process, and once they get approved, they build what was approved. So if it's not appealed, then none of those letters are really relevant for the final plat. I mean, if you want them, we can certainly bring them, but sometimes it's a year later when they've built it. And once it's built, and it's built according to what the preliminary plat was approved at, you don't really have a choice at your level to approve or deny it. You can't add conditions, you can't do anything. It's really, did you build it? Yes, then you're approved. That's
So-
kind of how your process works. It's like an administrative, I don't want to call it a rubber stamp, but it almost is.
So maybe we need to back up, because I'm not sure I understand that whole process. I guess I was thinking, okay, you usually use the term preliminary and final. Usually preliminary doesn't mean you're putting shovels in the ground, right? I mean, that's, hey, okay, this looks good, now we're on to the next step. Shovels aren't gonna happen until it's final approved, but you're saying this is
No.
not
Oh,
the
no.
case.
No, that's not the
Preliminary
case.
means you're approved to build. So what's the purpose of the final? What
The-
purpose does that serve at all?
So where you see the final plat is only in major land partitions and subdivisions. And those two are different from minor land partitions in the sense that a major partition and a subdivision include the dedication of public right-of-way. And under state law, you have to sign the plat and accept that dedication. So like for true construction that you saw, it came to you because it was a subdivision and you were receiving that street right-of-way as cities. And kind of in that same requirement, it then moved forward to the county commissioners, because they also are required to sign, even though it's a city street, they're required under state law to also accept that dedication as a public right-of-way before it gets recorded. I don't know, whether or not the subdivision plat really has any bearing on anything. I think it's the right-of-way dedication that does, and so that's kind of what triggers that process. But,
So I'm gonna change my opinion. I don't like this one bit.
Well, I have a question that might clarify. How is an appeal presented? So if a neighbor says, I don't like this, can they make the formal appeal?
oh yeah, and that's the avenue, so that
So
would
then
be.
that is the way.
And then they could appeal, yeah, so it would go to the planning commission, and that's when we would have our typical hearing that we currently have. And their focus is going to be addressing that conflict. They're not going to be looking at, did you meet the standard, did you not meet the standard, unless the appellant points out something and claims it's not met, then they're going to focus on those items. And the mitigation items. So if somebody wants a fence, or I don't like your street lighting, and I don't like this, and I don't like that, that's when the planning commission then can have the conversation. They can negotiate back and forth between the applicant and the public and try to find some middle ground where everybody is satisfied, and then reach a decision. And if it still isn't satisfied, if folks don't feel that it's, that their needs have been met or compromised enough to work, they could appeal that into the council, then the council would ultimately make that decision.
When would the council be aware of like the application process? Only if there's.
Only if there's an appeal to the council.
An appeal. And could the council appeal it?
I've never seen that happen, but I suppose
Or maybe a member of the council. So
I suppose
I'm
it's
thinking of ways-
possible.
Is it?
I don't know that answer.
I think it's a standing question that I'm not
Right.
completely sure on, but if
Unless
you
you
need
were
to
a neighbor.
establish standing
I
to
don't
appeal
really-
it, but I don't.
Yeah, because that's the 100
if you're
feet,
not.
yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't been given notice.
Well, I mean, could someone appeal if they aren't one of the abutting neighbors, but they
You would need to have participated.
they like birds, and this particular area is a nesting place for the whatever.
Yeah.
So could someone that isn't abutting it appeal for whatever reason?
Yeah, they would have needed to be part of the initial application. Well, so there's different stages that they would be essentially a party to the application, and so they could have submitted a letter on the front end, or if they missed that because they just didn't know, and then there's an appeal, and then they catch wind of it later when it's going to the planning commission, as long as they submit a letter or they show up and provide testimony at the planning commission, then they're a party to the appeal. And then they could be part of that process at that point, or if their needs aren't met, then they would have standing that then they can appeal it to the city council. And then even take it further, if you don't feel that this is something that rises to the level that we can mitigate or deal with, and you issue a decision to support whatever is happening, somebody can then appeal it to the state after you.
Question.
And it could get really muddy and drag out for a long time.
Does that Riverside Parkway, where those people's houses along the side there, is that in play there? Is that the same thing or no?
If there was a subdivision and that pathway was part of the subdivision, then maybe. But the pathway, but that's a whole separate issue.
That's a separate one?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a whole separate thing. It's not related to this at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I think about the things that have come to that you've brought to the planning commission, I don't know how long I've been doing it, a year. There was the development of the cottage homes, Frankie Chen's one, right?
Yeah.
That was just, does it click the boxes to meet the code or not? If memory serves, like, my sense is you would have decided that as we did.
Yeah.
There was the first phase of true construction, and I think the only thing we really did was, the only issue I remember being contentious was whether they had to preserve that one spot so that there could be a pull-through so that we could encourage development of the other.
Yeah, and I would have required that anyway. The other piece they had with that one is they had variances and stuff, so that would have come to you anyway.
Okay.
But, or at least the variance would have.
And the last one was which side of which street does the building front on, right?
Mhm.
Which, I mean, that one seemed like how many angels can dance on that
Yeah.
pin. Like, I don't think there was a good legal answer to that one.
Yeah, you know, and really the property owner has a choice, but that's how you determine setbacks, is based on, you know, what are we gonna call the front of this one?
So would that then have been something you would have decided administratively and then
Yeah.
he could appeal or?
Yep.
I guess for me, it's just, it puts a lot of power in a single individual. And that's what I don't like. It's not that I don't trust you,
I
But-
agree, we've had this
but
conversation.
it's just that
Yeah.
there really is no process outside of someone that is within 100 feet of that property to go in and have standing to say, I don't know about this. And yet, you know, a massive subdivision can affect whole neighborhoods. It can affect the streets down from that with traffic, with flow of things. And so it's not that anybody here wants to stick their feet in the way and say, no, we want more building. We all want building in this community. We want to see our community grow. But to me, it's a balance between streamlining that process to make sure, you know, yeah, get through the hurdles quickly, but have a process in there where the public can provide input, where the council can come in and say, hey, look, we're concerned that this 200 home subdivision may massively change this side of town. You know, can we talk about this a little bit? Can we at least invite public input from maybe not just the neighbors on that bordering property, but what about all the others that are influenced by it? That's I guess where I sit on this, is all of a sudden that doesn't sound as appealing to me as you describe it this way. If that's the way the state dictates it, then it's top-down heavy and there's something we can do about it. But I don't like it.
I don't disagree with you at all, and I think that that's part of the conversation as we go through, once we actually get to the actual code language.
Yeah.
That I think it's worth having some conversation, because we have a section, and I think, Jamin and Lydia, I think we have the chart in there for where it talks about neighborhood meetings and stuff. I think that's in the packet, and we have some changes for that, but there's there's a section in there where it talks about controversial projects and it requires a neighborhood meeting. And I've had the same concern. We've had this conversation that I don't like it, and the bottom line is it doesn't matter what I like, because this is state law. And so I think what we need to do from this point is if that's what we have to settle on, where we do have options to change, is we could change the standards. Is what do you have to submit? What are your steps you have to go through in this administrative process in order to at least make this as palatable as possible? It still has to be clear and objective, but how do you deal with that? And if we want more public involvement on that front end, how do we create that? And we have to be careful because it's going to apply to everybody. It's not just going to apply to who we pick, and so it
And if you
could,
make it too burdensome for someone just building
somebody who comes in with only
duplex,
4 lots is going to be
or-
subject to the
right.
same process as somebody who's doing
Right.
250.
Right.
And so we have to be really careful what we do, but that's how we solve that.
Yeah.
Can I think, if I'm understanding this, so the way that your administrative process is set up is based on what's in the codes, is that right? And so our input is how the codes are changed to address this big change.
Yeah, so if you see something like this, where we have some concerns, then we start looking at what is the code actually, what are the standards, what is the process, and how do we change that to still fit the requirements that we have, the parameters and the rules we have to stay within. But how do we satisfy our concerns by adjusting the rules in the process?
I would imagine the state does the law say that you can only notify 100 feet?
Oh, no, that's us.
Right, so we
We could change
could
that.
up that, but then for the poor guy who wants to do 4 lots, suddenly he's got to notice, give notice to a lot of people. Could we leave the notice at 100 feet, but say anyone who resides in LeGrand has the opportunity to give written comment?
Well, we could certainly say that. I mean, I don't, because it doesn't really hurt who, anybody can provide
Anybody
written
can
comment. It's who
provide
we're
comment,
legally required to send notice to. But, something that we could have a conversation about when we get to the actual code language is, we could change that notice of 100 feet that in the case of like a subdivision or something of that scale, if it's over 10 lots, you could require a neighborhood meeting. That could be your trigger. It could be 20 lots, it could be 50 lots.
You don't want to overcomplicate, but you could scale it.
Right, so.
And that would be a way of
But-
avoiding the pitfall of the small property owner having to go through this egregious process, but sizing the impact that we think it may have and getting that reach to match the degree of the impact based on its
Yeah,
size.
we just have to make it very clear what the trigger is, so that somebody knows when they get there, and so that we can administer it fairly and the same every single time.
Yeah, you just want the opportunity to give a few more people standing to appeal that for the projects that would have a farther reaching effect.
Yeah.
And
I-
what about putting all projects that have submitted applications on the website?
Yeah, that is an option I was going to bring it up. I think some of the cities have done is you could have sort of a development hub, right? People can sort of see a map or see a listing,
Yeah.
and I'm like, commit you to more work in doing that, but
Well, and
we're seeing other cities have done that partly just to give more visibility to projects that are happening people
And
feel
that is kind of
like-
people's due diligence to
To look to
nose
check it out.
around.
Yeah, and I would ask that we not specifically put it in code, because then we would create a burden that we may or may not be able to achieve every time. Or depending on what it looks like in the future, it may become to
Or
the
one of
point
those-
where suddenly we have to hire staff to do this. And
Yeah,
so,
or one of those triggers that
but-
if it's more than 4 lots or
Yeah,
something
but-
like that.
But I'm just thinking we can create a policy. We can create in-house policy to administer it, but if you write it in code, especially if it's in our land use standards, it's really hard to get it out, and it's
Gotcha.
really hard to change it.
Okay.
So it's better to do it in policy, and I think it's something that we should be doing now. We shouldn't be waiting for the code to change. But anyway, that's just my opinion, but I would ask as we go through this to not physically write it into code.
So is that something that you as a planning commission can maybe discuss or bounce around and then maybe make a recommendation on policy decisions or
Yeah, and
policy
I think it'd be something our city manager would end up doing
Okay.
at some point, but at this point, what I would ask is that we kind of save this as a, chalk it up as a to-do, and let's save it,
Yeah.
because we are, at the same time as we're kind of going through some staff stuff, we're also having a whole new website transition, because our platform is shifting from some old school model to a new school. The website's not going to change much, but we're going to have a lot more features and a lot more user-friendly opportunities to do stuff. And once we get that switched, what we're talking about today might be really easy to do, and it might be really quick. And so, at this point, I think it's great. Let's chalk it up as a to-do. It's something that we should have been doing yesterday that we want to do tomorrow. But let's kind of wait, because, you know, and at staff level, we'll figure it out and somehow figure out how to make it happen at the soonest point possible.
My question, I think I have the answer to, did the state approach local communities for their input about any of this at all before they passed these laws?
So, sort of. So there's committees that, and I even sat on one, you know, a number of years back, but they ask folks like myself. I think Gus Chachis, one of our developers, sat on one from a developer side. So they are asking folks, but our task as our one person in our community that sits on it, we represent everybody. And we just have to do the best we can. And to be honest with you, as a small town person, our voice is only partially heard. It is heard, but like at a whisper. You know, if you want to kind of put it that way, because the folks who are the drivers are all the housing advocates and the housing agencies that come together because they're dealing with, you know, the services that are providing the housing that they're struggling to find homes for folks. And so their voice is the dominant voice in these committees. But the short answer is yes, but only sort of, because it's a very limited amount of participation from the communities.
Thank you.
Jim, as we go through this, it might be helpful to just highlight of the changes, what are mandated and what are discretionary.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say the exception will be anything that's discretionary. I think pretty much everything we've included with Michael's direction in this scope has been, we wanted to keep it pretty clean as stuff that was mandated and not overwhelming with too many policy decisions as part of this. But I think actually almost everything here is mandatory. We have a couple of things we pointed out that are discretionary sort of as a result of how do you want to implement this change.
Thank you.
So just to wrap up on this item, I have a couple things just to follow up on. I think the idea about having a wider notice for larger projects, I think that's legal. We'll have to go and check and make sure that's okay to do, but I think that would be fine, and we can look at restructuring it that way. I can send Michael some examples of that kind of development hub, so giving people more transparency what projects are happening. Another thing we could do, Michael, is just look at if there have been any key issues with past subdivision applications that have not been, that we can trace back to some issue in the code, and we can sort of do another look at that and see if you want to package anything with this amendment.
Well, yeah, at this point, I can tell you that there really hasn't, because we haven't had anything big enough that's generated conflict.
Yeah.
And so I'm just anticipating this 200 and some watt, or however many it is going to be a big deal. And when it comes, depending on how they present that, it could be significant. So, and that one actually has transportation impacts, and I think when we start getting into the question that David had, I don't know if we could put a measurement on notice that would be sufficient in reaching out to folks, because I think it's going to take a notice that's going to cover like a quarter of the city, because all of the roads that serve that are substandard, and there's going to be some significant traffic impacts that are going to be part of that, and I think all the folks in that transportation corridor need to be noticed somehow. And I think what we have to be careful of is whatever we put for our notice in the code, that is the notice where we have to do. We can't decide that, oh, the standard, we bumped it up to 250, and then we decide that, oh, because this one we think has higher impacts, we go 500. We can't do that.
No.
250 is it. And so we need to, I think that's where we start getting into the conversation of, if we're going to be changing that distance, we need to put some thresholds on If it's a 5-lot subdivision, or maybe it's a 10 or 20, now you've crossed the line, then now it's this notice. If it's a 100-lot subdivision, now we go this distance. If it's 200 lots, you go this distance. And maybe there's a formula that has, we don't have to necessarily call it out that specific, but it's just a formula based on how many lots, this is the distance of notice.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, I think that will solve that. But anyway, just in the sake of time anyway, it'd be nice if we can kind of just move forward, because this is a big packet.
Sure. Any other questions on this for Okay. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to Lydia.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, so I am switching gears a bit. So this is a specific housing type that we're going to be talking about, which are called single room occupancies, or an SRO, is commonly what folks call it. So it is similar to kind of like a dorm room. So you essentially in a building there would be these SRO units, and so there'd be these lockable bedrooms, but there'd be common spaces. So there'd be a shared kitchen oftentimes, sometimes there's shared bathrooms. And so this is a housing type that now the state requires that communities allow in their residential zones. And so in your LDC, SRO buildings must be permitted in all residential zones. So all zones must allow for SRO buildings with up to 6 units, so 6 of those bedrooms, wherever there is a single unit dwelling. And then in zones that have multifamily or multi-unit developments, the number of the units permitted is equivalent to the number of units that are permitted in that multi-unit building. So if, for instance, in your multi-unit zone, you allow a 15-unit multifamily housing development, you would have to allow 15 SRO units in that building. So that's kind of how they are requiring cities to allow this housing type. So what does that look like as far as in your zones? So in your kind of 4 zones, your more lower density, so your hillside development, your rural residential, your low density, and then your medium density residential, you must allow SRO buildings with 6 or fewer units. And then in your multi-unit, your multifamily zones, your high density, and then your residential professional, you must allow also kind of broader than 6 units SRO buildings. So that is one of kind of a newer housing type. And I know you already have dorm rooms, and you probably have a lot of college students that have maybe similar houses that have this type of kind of development or use going on. So this is in some ways maybe codifying some of that. But that is kind of one of the new housing types. Are there any questions about this?
How does that work if there's a conflict with like regulations on parking spaces?
So essentially, you're going to be applying the same parking requirements that you would apply for a single unit. So is it multifamily, you have 2 spaces per unit? Or is it
No,
more?
so this is
Change to that. but
This
I don't
is,
remember what
this
it
is
was.
another one of my challenges, just like the subdivision one. So an SRO is treated the same as a single-family housing unit. It doesn't matter how many rooms you have in that SRO. It's interpreted as one single-family dwelling unit. And our code, because state law essentially changed, is you can only require 1 parking space per dwelling unit. And we've kind of taken it to a different level, because duplexes and all of that kind of stuff that's where you can only require up to 1 space per unit. And so we've applied that standard to everything, because that's consistent with how state law is. And so single families, we could theoretically require 2. But if you're a duplex, you can only require 1 per unit. So we just, from a fairness standpoint, we're only doing 1 for single family as well. But anyway, but that's where the parking issue is going to be, is you can't require additional parking because somebody has 5 units in their SRO, as opposed to just 1.
The SRO is the building, not the room.
Well, there's a quantity of rooms in your.
But when you refer to the
I'll let Lydia respond to
SRO,
that.
that's the whole building.
Yeah.
Is that what I'm hearing? So,
Yes, for the purposes of calculating your like a parking requirement, it would be the units that all share that kitchen or bedroom, that would be, or kitchen or bathroom, they would be, there'd be sort of think of them as like a quad or a cluster, right?
Sure.
That would be considered one dwelling unit.
One SRO, one.
Well, the SRO is the sort of just the broader term for the type. There's SRO units, and then when you, to be equivalent to a dwelling unit, it would be however many share a kitchen or a bathroom, which could be quite a few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're saying that we can only require one parking place for that?
For that full package.
It's required, yeah.
For that package. Yeah.
That's
You know,
ridiculous.
but that's the direction the state is going, and I don't know how many conversations I've been in, but it's several per every year since, I think, House Bill 2002, whatever year that was. But as the state wants us to eliminate parking completely as a requirement. They don't think parking is important. It's like, people are transitioning to having less cars. But I think the challenge with rural communities is we also don't have the robust transit
Right, we
to
don't
give
have
somebody an
transportation
alternative. And so that's where we struggle, is we don't have an alternative for folks if you're gonna eliminate, reliance on their vehicle. And so it's a struggle for rural communities to get on board with, with that. But it's state law, so it's kind of one of these things, we just gotta kind of suck it up, and
Unless
that's
you make
what
like
we have to
2-hour
do.
parking on those streets and.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of,
I
I think there's a
know,
lot of
but-
buildings that go ahead and have more parking. It's required just to have one per unit. I mean,
Right.
You're not restricted, but I mean, because like, we have a place right next to us and there's 5,
Right.
next to us, and they use the street. So, I mean, it's,
Right, it's a minimum, not a maximum.
yeah, and that's what we need to look at. It's a minimum. A lot of times people look at that and think, oh, this is all we can have. It's a minimum.
Right, and we present it that way as well, and you just find that most folks that are building something, they try to build what they need.
Right.
They don't focus on, oh, I only have to have one space, great.
Yeah.
But they try to build what they need. Where it becomes a challenge is when you're dealing with the infill in our older neighborhoods, is they have the ability to add more dwelling units and do stuff, but they don't have the ability to add parking, so they don't. And that's where it becomes a challenge, but.
Right, you're correct.
So we've heard the concern, I want to point out that there is a bill in the legislature right now that also amends this language related to SROs. And so one approach that we've taken is we're going to monitor that prior to wrapping up our scope of work and our contract with the city, and see if that gives the city any other flexibility in what kind of parking standards they would apply, or other standards they would apply to SROs. So our interpretation of it now is it needs to be equivalent to what you would apply to a dwelling unit, but that could change when the bill comes.
Seems like there should be a difference between what's required for larger cities versus smaller, more rural communities.
Yeah, that often is the case in legislation, that they separated and applied different standards to smaller cities. In this case, they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, the other reality is that there's 6 counties that have less than 25,000 people, and we make up 3% of the population of the state. So as frustrating as it is when they legislate without us in mind, it's very rational for them to legislate, like it's very efficient. It would be wildly inefficient to legislate for 3% of the population. But we're an exception.
All right, I'll keep us moving here. Okay, so the next one here is occupancy limits based on familial relationships. So there was a bill passed that requires cities to no longer limit the number of people living in a unit based on whether they're related. So currently the city has a definition of family, and it limits the number of folks who are unrelated to live in that dwelling. And so now we're kind of the direction is to replace family with household. And so you could have a limit of the number of folks living in that unit, but it's not based on whether they're related or not. In addition, you'll see previously there was single family detached or multifamily. Now it's single detached unit or multi-unit dwelling. So kind of replacing that family with unit. We're talking about housing types.
That makes a lot more sense.
If you want to have a restriction at all, could you base it like on square footage as opposed to relations or any of that type of thing?
You could, we talked about this, if you recall, Michael, at the challenge, if you then apply that limit to a household, you would have to also apply that to if there was a large family living together. Right, so when cities have chosen to limit the household size, it's usually pretty large, something like 12 people living together in a household or something like that, because they don't want to inadvertently create a situation where
Harm a big family.
a large family
Right,
is not,
right.
is not in compliance with that rule. So as the code structured right now, there is no limit on the size of a household, theoretically. Practically, well, no, there's limited how many people can live together, and most people don't want to bunk up into 20 people in a house. But theoretically, the zoning code would not have a rule that prevents that. Now, if there's a large number of people living together in a house and they're causing a nuisance to the neighbors, then that could be addressed in other ways outside of the zoning code. Different nuisance laws or noise ordinances, things like that.
Is there a certificate of occupancy? Like, I guess in the last city I lived in, when you went through your final permitting, you couldn't move in until you had a certificate of occupancy, and it had a maximum number of people that could live there or occupy the space even safely.
I don't know if our certificate of occupancy for residential does that. I know it does for commercial, or all non-residential uses, but I don't know if it does. The closest thing I can think of would be a group housing quarter thing, so where you're, like a care facility kind of thing, but they're still, while they're technically residential in nature, they're a non-residential use under the building code.
It was less to protect the community and more to protect the people in the building. Like, I always thought it was a fire code thing.
Yeah.
Because the fire department doesn't want 7 people in every room because they can't find them.
Yeah, I'm not aware if there is that.
All right, I'll keep us moving here. So still on this topic, but this is actually one where we're looking for your feedback on, where there's a little bit more discretion. So in the code, there is what's called a medical hardship resident. And so someone can temporarily live in a manufactured dwelling on a property if their relative is living in that main house and has a medical issue that maybe they need a family member to come and live on that property during that time. Based on this new requirement, there can't be you can't require that person who lives on that lot is related to the main resident of that house, if that makes sense. So essentially kind of what the city can do is you can either allow unrelated persons to temporarily occupy that manufactured dwelling. So think about maybe a caretaker, maybe they're not related to the person living in the home, but they want to live on the property, or a family friend or something like that. Or we could remove this section entirely and not have a medical hardship residence allowance. And so I think that's kind of our feedback, or we're looking from you is, are you open to allowing this to be for unrelated persons, or would you rather this section be removed, given that you can't require it to be a
I think we should leave it in there and have it be a medical caretaker, because, that keeps people in their homes.
You do have an option of an accessory dwelling unit, is a similar idea, and that must be allowed by the state law, and you have that allowance today in the code. They have a few different design standards, size limitations that may make it a little bit more challenging to use a manufactured home be placed on a lot as an accessory dwelling unit. And it's probably possible, but it might be a little more complicated. So this would be a little bit more flexible. Part of the reason, rationale, I think, in the code, that it doesn't have any design standards for what the manufactured home looks like, because the idea is that it is temporary, and there's an expiration date for you need to get to it either be renewed or it expires and you're not allowed to have it anymore. So
My recommendation is to remove it.
Yeah.
I think I would.
So we created this in 1998 because we had one property owner that had a desire to take advantage of this. So we did a code change and we added it. And the requirement is that once that occupant is no longer occupying that, the house gets removed.
Yeah.
And then Robert will remember, because he and I chatted about this, but we ended up going through a fairly significant legal issue with the property owner because it's expensive to remove a house once you've installed it.
And what is temporary mean?
And, yeah, so, but once that occupant is no longer there, then they went through every little hoop they possibly could to figure out how can I keep a second house on my property that doesn't meet city code, that was only put there temporary, and it's gonna cost me 15 or 20,000 now to get rid of it, and all the utilities and everything to connect it. And so, in the course of, I think, my entire career here, which, you know, and probably even before mine, we've just never had them, we've only had 2. And ever since we changed our code to start allowing accessory dwelling units, and now we allow cottage homes. And cottage homes are even more advantageous because there's no size limit. I mean, with the exception of 1,000 square feet, but the medical hardship residence is still, most of those are, at least the 2 that we've had inquiries about, the one that we had, were less than that. And so, with the cottage home industry, with the accessory dwelling units, this isn't even in demand anymore for LaGrange. We haven't had a medical hardship residence for over 20 years in our community.
Okay.
And so,
Why have it here?
I just don't think the demand is there, and the concern that I have is if we can't relate, you know, have the people related to who's living in the house, then we can just have somebody decide that they want a caretaker business and I'm gonna rent to this person, and then if the house goes away, then they can bring it back again under another permit and just keep doing it. And I don't think we want somebody to make a business out of this. This was created and intended to help, for you to help your family member, and there's much better ways. If that's what you want to do, that's great, but let's do it as an ADU or let's do it as a cottage home, because we now allow those, but we didn't allow them then. And I just don't ever see anybody doing this again. I just don't see anybody, because we have better options that are permanent, that aren't going to require you to get that home out of there at that huge expense.
I can agree with moving that.
Yeah, because
Taking it off.
Robert will kind of, he'll remember, because it was a very hard conversation to tell somebody. It's like, well, I'm sorry you can't afford to get the house out of there, but that's what you got to do.
Yeah, I remember this.
And that's a hard conversation to tell somebody to shell out that kind of money to get rid of a house that they promised that they would when their permit expired.
So it sounds like there's potential for abuse, and there's
Yeah.
alternatives that
There's
serve the
more
purpose.
alternatives now.
And so,
Right.
Yeah.
And
The
if
one
there's a
wrinkle-
demand in the future, we can always bring it back in the future under a different model if suddenly we have a need. But I think our alternatives, I think, are a better choice for folks today.
The one wrinkle I'd add, just on if someone was to propose as an ADU, is that you have some standards in there that say that the siding materials and the roof pitch and of the ADU should match the primary dwelling. And that may be difficult for someone to do with a manufactured dwelling being placed on a lot. It's a little harder for them.
But I
to
think
do.
that's
So-
it's not always a bad thing, because some of this is about the character of the neighborhoods and the community, and so, you know, you could see some neighbors getting upset.
And the
If
placement
in the
of
wrong
the property.
neighborhood, somebody goes and puts a manufactured home sitting right there, that may not match any of the surrounding dwellings. And so, I mean, to me, it gives the city a little bit more, there's a little more assurance that that's gonna match. There's some permanence to it. So I don't know that I see it as a negative.
Yeah,
In fact,
I was just
think that's positive.
raising it as that it's not a perfect replacement for what you have here. Is that
Yeah.
it would maybe be challenging to do that in some cases. One thing we could offer is I've seen cities that have those standards that the ADU match the primary dwelling, but then they also have an alternative
Yes.
to that, which is,
On the ADU.
it has some basic standards for the sort of aesthetic quality of the house that maybe doesn't match it exactly, but you have these things on it, so that the siding is at least this kind of siding and has, you know, things like that would make it. So we could offer that to Michael to review, is just, do we want to offer that so that there's a recourse if someone trying to put a manufactured dwelling as an ADU, we may have a little bit more flexibility to try to get that approved.
Yeah, if we can, Jim, and I think Lydia's got a slide for ADUs.
Yeah.
And then, so we could have that conversation in more detail if we need to, once we kind of hit those design standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can. Okay, great. Okay, moving on, so Jamin touched on this, and so did Michael, clear and objective requirements. So there's state law now that requires cities to adopt clear and objective standards, conditions, procedures, which we've kind of touched on. And so that relate to housing, so that can be everything from design standards to development standards, land use applications. And so that's not to say that the city can't provide what's called alternative approval options. So you can have a clear and objective path, but you can also provide a more discretionary path if maybe an applicant decided that they didn't want to go that route. PUDs is an example, planned unit developments that are a more discretionary process. So I think this is an example here that we can look to of what's not clear and objective and how is that modified. So for instance, in the code, there's this requirement for parking spaces, so traffic flow arrows and signage may be required. How to change that to clear and objective is painted traffic flow arrows and signage shall be required for all one-way drive aisles. So it provides more clarity that both the applicant and city staff that's reviewing it can easily check that box that this person provided that. So that's really the intent behind it. And we can kind of walk through another example in the code here. As we mentioned, all of the blue are the sections in the amendments that relate to this specific requirement. And oftentimes a lot of it is minor things like maybe it's the dimensions you require a dormer, but you need to specify what's the height or kind of the depth of that. So a lot of the times it can just be more of a dimensional requirement to better clarify a requirement. So here on the next slide are the actual sections that have been amended in the LDC to be clear and objective. Everything from kind of a definition related to flag lot, ADU design standards. So on page 30 of your packet are the standards for accessory dwelling units. And you can see in that section D, where it's blue, is the building design for accessory dwelling units. So originally it was requiring that accessory dwelling units shall have the same style of siding and roofing materials and colors as the primary single-family dwelling. Now we've modified it for all accessory dwelling units. The exterior siding and roofing material must be same in type, size, and placement as the exterior finish material of the primary structure. Right. So that is kind of what Jamin was getting to as he was mentioning related to that requirement. Was there anything else you wanted to add related to that?
No, are there any on this list that you want to us to go into more depth and explain sort of the rationale of why it needs to be clear and objective, or how the language has changed, or anything else you saw in the packet?
So one was like under the parking and loading I looked at. It's Article 7, page 23. Item D, there it worries me a little bit, and I just want to clarify. Right, I mean, because we take the word adequate out of there.
Okay.
Right, I mean, that's, okay, is adequate an objective thing? I think that's objective. Why would we remove that word?
I don't think it's objective.
Adequate? There's standards for stormwater drainage, are there not?
So just to give you clarification on that particular item. So when we deal with, adequate is a little bit subjective of what's adequate to you versus adequate to me, versus what's the developer, because a developer, what we find is that a developer will just propose a bioswale, for example. Is the size of that bioswale adequate to receive the drainage? Who's going to determine whether or not, under the word adequate, how much water is going into that? And so this makes it more clear so that when we get a stormwater drainage plan, our public works will look at it, and if there's question whether or not it meets our code as far as volumes, then they'll have an engineer, they'll require the applicant to get an engineer to say that this is how much water is going to flow off of all of your impervious surfaces and go into this bioswale, and your bioswale is dimensionally sized to receive all of that, so therefore it meets it in accordance with this code. Or if they tap into the city stormwater drainage, then it's an instant checkbox, says, yep, it's contained on site and then diverted into our, into a catch basin that goes into our system, so therefore it meets our code. But I think when you get into adequate, then suddenly we then would need to identify a standard and define what adequate means.
Right, but so
Yeah.
again, going back to that, are there no objective standards? I mean, kind of what you just referenced, like an engineer can look at this and say, yeah,
Contained on site is what is the modification. I mean, I could see a homeowner saying, yeah, this is adequate, and my house doesn't flood, but it floods the neighbor's property, and it's adequate for this house, but it's not adequate for the neighbor.
Yeah, see, I like the way this one's worded, because I think this is very black and white, that
Yeah.
either you meet the standard or you don't.
It's deferring to other elements of your code that ensures that you're
okay. And
adequately.
I guess that's just what I'm
meeting
wondering is,
that,
yeah, how's this gonna bounce? Because if somebody says, yeah, that's my stormwater drainage, and we're like, that's not stormwater drainage. But is there recourse there to say, no, there are objective standards, minimums that we require to be met?
Yes.
And if there are, then great, and as long as this is gonna fall to that.
Yeah, so since it refers to in accordance with this code, because we do have a stormwater drainage, section, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to submit in a stormwater drainage plan. And that's when Public Works gets involved. And fortunately, right now, our Public Works director is a geotechnical engineer and understands this stuff. But as kind of the default or fallback is we do require that applicants, especially on big projects anyway, we require them to get a third party or an independent engineer to certify stuff. But this is one of our clear and objective ones that I think makes it a lot easier for applicants to know that I met that standard.
Okay, good.
And you're not gonna change the goalpost on me after I submit.
There's at least one area in the same section that I have some concerns about in that it seems inconsistent to me. For instance, at the bottom of page 25, it lists requirements for residential use, and then on the following page 26, you go down near the bottom, trailer parks and/or mobile home parks. Actually, it looks like they're allowing more spaces for a unit there than there would be in a regular residential.
Yeah, I think that's a good catch. We probably need to change the trailer parks to match because
Yeah.
the standard is one, and so this is probably one that we need to change.
Actually, a little higher up on 26 as well, rooming houses, lodging houses, dormitories, sounds a lot like SROs. And it's this, but here it actually says one space for each sleeping room, which I think we would prefer, but my understanding was that's what the state is saying you can't do for SROs.
Yeah, I think that's a good catch. That I actually noted that earlier when I was looking at this. I think
Don't we
there's, yeah, there is, so there's a few uses in here that would stay, so, what to separate out, but things like bed and breakfast, and then residential homes and residential facilities, those are separate from SROs, those
Right.
are, sort of, group living, care
Adult assisted
houses.
living.
These are-
Yeah.
The people are also, they're living there, but they're also receiving medical care. So those are a different use. But rooming houses, lodging houses, dormitories, to look at those others, clubs and fraternity houses, would, I don't know about dormitories, but those may be, I know rooming houses and lodging houses, we looked at the definition and we struck those definitions because they're equivalent to an SRO. So we will take a look at that and more closely separate that out, but you could continue to apply that one parking requirement, one space for sleeping room to any of the uses that are not classified as SROs under the state's definition.
I think, yeah, I think the intent for that one at least is bed and breakfast kind of fall under that lodging category. And I think we have, I don't know if we have a lodging
Yeah, on
one, but
24
it might be
lodging.
something that we just pull it out into its own category. Because a lot of these other ones are residential, and some of those, like residential care facilities, I mean, a lot of those, you have folks that don't even drive. But on the flip side, they are commercial uses, and the standard for the parking is intended to achieve how many employees, what do you do for guest parking in these that are technically non-residential in nature, even though you have residences staying there. And so if we're going to change that formula away from per room, then we need to write the standard in when we start talking about the number of employees, or base it on a square footage or something, so that we're accounting for the employees and the staff that are working in the semi-non-residential environment.
And could that better be looked at as a place of business versus?
Right, and some of those are, like dormitories, I'm not really sure. I think that's kind of a different animal than some of these other
In a
ones.
retirement home or a nursing home.
Yeah.
And then on page 4, one of my little nitpicky things is a nursing home, the definition, providing care and nurture for the elderly. I would also put disabled, because there's 35-year-old people in nursing homes who are not elderly, but they need to be there.
Do you, just because I know that you're familiar with
That's
the
my
industry,
thing.
is there this, just to give you some background, this definition I know came from our 93 code, and it may even have came from an 80-something code.
Oh, wow.
And so, a lot of these definitions haven't changed in who knows how long. So, if you're familiar, being more familiar with the industry, if there's a definition, and we should be changing this language just like you mentioned, but if there's a better definition out there, this is a great opportunity to swap it out and define something for what it really is.
Right.
And so I don't know if that's something that you'd be willing to do, is kind of, I guess, look at the stuff in your industry, and if you guys define it somehow.
I mean, I would say elderly or disabled, but
Yeah. But if
it's
that-
also offensive if you're elderly and you don't need to be in a nursing home and you know.
But we'll make a note of that, and we'll also look at that, but it's super helpful when we come across these for folks that are experts in the industry to go, oh, this is what this really means.
We can look at other examples.
Yeah, there's an overlap with the term residential facility, which has a state definition, which is usually the term that's used to mean a facility where people that have disabilities or need other care live. So that's the term that's usually used. I'm not sure. We'll have to go and check and make sure. I think we reviewed it in the code audit that term is up to date in your code, and that would have been, if there was a facility that was being proposed that didn't only care for people that are older, but also care for people with disabilities, that they would be approved to have this.
Assisted living.
Yeah. It's
But
called a
I would-
residential care facility.
Yeah, and I would change that, that wording.
Mike, one thing I was looking for in here on parking, and I may have just overlooked it, having to do with sight lines on streets where there's a lot of on-street parking.
That's in the landscaping chapter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so in the landscaping, and I think that's a clear and objective one, because I don't think that was identified. It's a very fixed measurement off the center point of an intersection, and it's 90 feet each direction, and then it creates a triangle at the corners. And then, so that's the clear vision area that has to be maintained out in kind of an open manner. And I think the issue, maybe that's running through your mind, because it always runs through mine, is we just need to figure out how to do a better job in enforcement, maybe on some locations. But we do look at that in every application.
Okay.
So new development, we harp on that. It's existing stuff that's just been out there forever, where you just see landscaping just evolves over time and just grows. Is we just don't have the enforcement resources to go out and for citywide is to have people do shrub pruning.
So,
Yeah, I remember
go ahead.
I remember some years ago, there was a push by the state, I think, to encourage on-street parking versus off-street parking. My concern with it
Yeah.
has been a safety issue, because there are some of those places, you get all those cars on the street, you take your life in your hands, almost literally pulling out sometimes, because you can't see.
Yeah, so for the parking, separate from the landscaping and stuff that's in the parkway strip, the only thing that we have that deals with sight lines and visibility just has to do within our, it's a separate traffic ordinance or that the police department deals with, is how close to an intersection you can park.
Exactly.
But, but that's something, that's different from our land use code, because now you're inside the right of way itself and you're not on the private property side. So we deal with the private side through our land use code.
Right.
But if we want to deal with that on the right-of-way, then that'd be a separate conversation that we'll need to have with our parking traffic safety folks to see if we're gonna change that distance threshold to something that's not consistent with the state, and we're gonna be more restrictive, so that's a whole other conversation.
Seems like it could be clear and objective at least.
Yeah.
Mike, my understanding, we require bicycle parking spaces?
Yes,
That's what it says. Yeah.
that's your alternative to cars. That came in around, I
I'm
think,
sure my business is not in compliance. I mean,
There's-
like, is there a defined standard, or is it just like, hey, there's a sidewalk space? Because I mean, I'm thinking of the little mini malls around, there's no parking stalls
No,
there.
there's not.
There's the Safeway.
yeah, there is a standard, and for new developments coming in, your building has just pre-existed for,
So it's grandfathered,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But,
And like TJ Maxx, places like that, they don't have to have that because it's
And they-
grandfathered in.
right, well, I would say they're grandfathered in, because I know it predates, you know, anything that I can even think of.
Okay.
Because that standard came in around 99 when we did our transportation plan.
Okay. all right,
And
thanks.
so-
Yeah, I'm just like,
so that's-
I don't
so
see a
generally-
bicycle anywhere.
Yeah, so generally, when you look at that, you just go, does it predate 1999? And if that building does, then it's grandfathered in.
Okay.
But I can't tell you how many times people challenge that standard, and then they end up putting bicycle parking in, because it's like, nobody's gonna ride their bike there. You know, so that's a common thing, but that's,
Okay.
yeah, anyway, it's in there.
So back to the landscaping materials, page 22. Says you gotta have live plant coverage of greater than 50% of the landscape area.
Yeah.
Why?
That is
Why
our,
that much?
so that is,
I'm thinking,
That's our urban
thinking
forestry
fire mitigation.
well, I think then you wanna get into the type of plant material rather than plant material itself.
Yeah.
So what that standard is because we are proud to be a Tree City USA, we're proud to have green
No, I live.
and then we do the
yeah.
beautification award stuff, and so this,
Right,
this,
yeah.
this chapter in the code stuff, I essentially defer to our urban forestry commission for what the requirements are. And the 50% is based at maturity, so at least when somebody plants, we wanna have 50% coverage. And if they wanna do something that's just all rock with boulders, and they don't want, then they plant a tree. Because the tree gives you 100% coverage at maturity instantly. And, you know, we give them credit for maturity even though it goes in as a small tree. And so we are really encouraging street trees through this standard, but otherwise you're doing ground cover, like if somebody plants lawn, grass, you know, you got 100% coverage. If you just do shrubs, we want you to have enough shrubs so it provides the coverage. And 50% is really not, when you actually do the math and you look at it, it's really not that much. And and if somebody doesn't like that coverage, they plant a tree. And so it's actually works out really well. And, but anyway, I'm probably not the one to be the advocate to justify it for you, because it's the Urban Forestry Commission that essentially.
No, I was just wondering, and I
Yeah.
was just thinking
Yeah,
fire and.
yeah, and these came in, I think, I wanna say around 2006 or so is when this standard came in, and it's because we had a few projects that they put their landscaping in with the combination of the right things, but essentially it was no landscaping, it was just a bunch of rocks. And it was hideous, and the Forest Commission says, we can't allow this. And so then there was a whole work session, and the city council at the time, you know, agreed because the example was presented to them, and everybody agrees, like, we can't have that. So that's where the standard kind of came from. But
Okay.
Are there any other questions on any of these other sections related to clear and objective changes?
I just see with the off-street parking requirements, all kinds of inconsistencies there in terms
Yeah.
of,
that table, shoot, I'm thinking it came from, I know it came from the 93 code, and we've just edited it as we've gone. And it could be something that, we could have a whole work session on that.
Yeah, I think
But
so.
the challenge that we run into is, what is the magic number you're gonna settle on, and is that the right number? And that's partly why we haven't tackled it, because if you're gonna change that number, what do you change it to? And what's a reasonable number? that is fair as just across the board that everybody has to comply with and not just the example that we think of. And so it's a daunting task, so.
My quick question, is the focus and the intent of this work session and the amendments that we're about to make limited to those sections that have changes proposed, or is the intent to go line by line through this entire thing and do things? Because we've got a lot of non-residential pieces that aren't covered by the task that are contained in some of these sections, like some of the landscaping things that are in here really don't. They apply to commercial, and I just want to make sure that we're defining what our task is to only coming into compliance with those legislative changes that we have not completely rewriting the entire section. Did I say that right?
Yeah, so to get at that, our task tonight doesn't have to be our task for this project, but our task tonight is to go through these recommendations focused on the residential and getting ourselves into compliance with state stuff. And so if you see other things in here that are not marked up, that are for commercial, industrial, or some of these other things that we want to have another conversation with, the best thing I can think of is let's make a note of that. And because we're under no obligation to just flip this tonight and then bring this back to you in one of our next city council meetings or planning commission and adopt it immediately. The expectation is that we will adopt this and make the changes, but we're not under a deadline. And so I would recommend that if there's other things that you want to talk about, that is something that we could either do another joint work session and kind of go through it. We could have the planning commission kind of go through stuff, but we can come up with a game plan for that maybe after this and decide what level. But for tonight's task is to kind of go through this. And if we just want to say, this is a huge project, let's just adopt this and move on, and we'll come back to the other stuff in a future code amendment round. And that's what we have historically done because it is a huge project.
I do just want to clarify that our intent in identifying anything that needs to change to comply with climate objective standards were only standards that apply to housing.
Right.
So like the landscaping standard actually does, I think, apply to multifamily developments. That's why it was included in the parking lot standard as well. It may also apply to commercial and industrial as well, but because you have one standard that applies to both, you need to have that one be clear and objective.
All right, I'll keep us moving here. Okay, next section here is on duplex land divisions. So duplexes are required in the grant. Per HB 2001, that was a while back. But related to that are these duplex land divisions, which essentially kind of the intent is to enable each unit to be sold or owned individually. So you currently have an application process in the LDC that is for duplex land divisions, which is largely consistent with the state statute, but there are kind of a few key changes that we want to highlight that is within that section of the code. I'm trying to find it, but essentially, the first one here is minimum lot size and frontage standards can't be applied to each individual lot. So what we call is the parent lot is both of those units, so the entire kind of black outline you see on this example here, and then what we call child lots are the two lots that are subdivided. And so you can't apply minimum lot size to those subdivided, those child lots. So if you have a lot size requirement of 7,000 square feet, you can't require each lot to be that, but that entire black kind of outline to be 7,000 square feet.
It's page 49, by the way.
Thank you. And so in addition to that, there are frontage standards, so you can't require each individual unit to have a frontage. So I think this is a good example of showing that unit 1 is fronting the street, but unit 2 is not. And so that's kind of an example of where you are kind of required, or you're not allowed to have those frontage standards.
So my understanding is a duplex is one lot and one owner. is it not?
That's the thing that's a little tricky about this state law that's been enabled. So I guess the context might be helpful is that the city or the state required cities to enable or to allow duplexes and other middle housing types for other cities. Middle housing for other housing types. For the city of LeGrand, it's just duplexes in 2019. In 2021, the legislature came back and said you also need to allow, when you allow a duplex, you need to allow the land underneath that duplex to be split and to have those on separate lots, should the applicant want to do that. And so,
Separately.
We allow that anyway. So all the duplex division does is it creates condominiums. It creates a townhouse,
Right.
essentially. So,
Right.
so really in simplified forms, it's like there's really no reason why we wouldn't do this anyway, because we have some out there in our community. And in fact, if you go down to the, not necessarily this layout, but if you go down to that Jacob Street that is between 16th and 18th Street, it's like, it looks like a duplex subdivision. That is this. Every half of those buildings, each single unit sits on its own
Owned by
parcel. Essentially, it's a bunch
somebody
of
else,
townhouses.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is a pretty easy one, and so I didn't, when we were doing our conversation, I was like, yep, we're already doing it, so let's just clean it up and make it clear.
most of the time, it's like both units are facing the street and right, you got them side by side, and then you divide it up, and each have their own street frontage. That's what most of the duplexes look like. The wrinkle is here is that you have to allow it in this format as well, where one of the lots doesn't actually have its own street frontage. And it may not have its own vehicle access even, it may just have, share a parking stall with the other unit.
Through an easement or
Through an
something.
easement, yeah. So that's the kind of wrinkle here that's a little bit different. So it's actually a little more flexibility for someone to build something like this.
And so essentially, yeah, we're kind of modifying your current process that you have just to be compliant with these kind of state requirements here outlined. All right.
I should note that the units that are then created after that, they are not treated the same as a standard single-family lot, so you can't have an ADU unit or something like that. So it does sort of prevent this from being abused into then like you can't subdivide it again and create an ADU and you know, go on and on. So there's some sort of restrictions to make it that this is how it's going to stay.
Those are townhouses.
All right, so this is kind of the last section, which are just some other kind of minor changes that we wanted to highlight. So first one here related to manufactured dwellings. So essentially the state requires that any design standards that apply to manufactured dwellings also have to apply to single detached dwellings. So there are some standards in the LDC that only apply to manufactured dwellings, so those have been removed. For manufactured dwelling parks, it's now allowed use in the R1, R2, R3, and the RP zones per state requirement, as well as prefabricated structures, so things like tiny homes or modular homes are also allowed to be sited in manufactured dwelling parks. And the minimum lot size has been reduced to 1 acre, which again is state requirement. So recreational vehicles, or RVs, are allowed to be occupied as a dwelling unit in a manufactured home park now, if they are connected to utilities. So sometimes tiny homes are classified as an RV, so that would be kind of an example of what would now be permitted in a manufactured dwelling park. And then lastly here, so to allow for residential occupancy of an RV, if a manufactured dwelling or a single detached home is damaged due to natural disasters. So say a home is damaged to a fire and they're trying to rebuild it, and so they live in an RV while that house is being constructed. That's essentially the intention behind this allowance. And so
just for clarification on that, because we currently allow, through a temporary use permit, somebody to live in an RV while they're building their house for a period of time. Does this standard eliminate the temporary use permits, and now it's permitted outright?
no, it has a 2-year limit, I think. It has it's not permanent, it is a temporary.
Still a temporary use permit, so we still have a process to permit it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
This only applies to manufactured home parks though, right?
No, the last bullet point applies citywide anywhere. If you have a natural
Oh,
disaster and
right,
somebody
right.
becomes homeless, they can essentially live in their RV while they rebuild.
On that same lot. Yeah.
And we would actually allow them, through the temporary use permit process, if they're going to somewhere else, they could theoretically live in their RV while they're building in another location through our current process that we've had forever.
All right.
So about, just a little more context, a lot of the rationale behind that I might be able to understand is that, in a manufactured dwelling park today, most of the time in cities codes, the only thing that's allowed is something that meets the HUD code as a manufactured dwelling. The intent behind a lot of these is that there's new kinds of tiny homes and modular homes, things like that, that don't meet the HUD code but are safe to live in and have met other building code or occupancy standards. And so that's part of the reason this legislation was passed, is to enable those things to be placed in a manufactured dwelling park.
Yeah, thanks for that context.
On page 33, there's a strikeout in blue there. I'm confused as whether that applies strictly to manufactured homes. It seems to be in a section for them, but the wording itself doesn't seem quite clear. If that's a more general, or has been a more general requirement.
So you're seeing the additions to all dwelling units shall be architecturally compatible, that one?
Right, that
Yeah. So that is one that applies.
This applies everywhere in the city.
Everywhere to all.
This
kinds
is
of
just our
additions.
single-family home standards that apply to all new construction throughout the whole city.
How does that work with our historic building requirements?
Well, it won't matter for that because our historic stuff is in the downtown, and this is for new residential, single-family. So the title of this section is manufactured dwellings. Now it's going to be single detached, essentially single-family dwellings, duplexes, and apartments.
Okay.
So you're only dealing with residential.
Okay.
It's not really gonna apply downtown, because you're not really gonna be able to do additions and all that stuff on a fully built-out downtown, but either way, it's, even if you have some of this stuff, the more restricted it's gonna apply. So if you're in the downtown and somebody's able to do a residential, like I'm thinking the NK West building when that was constructed, you've got the Oddfellows building a couple doors down when that was done, is you still have the historic district standards that are still gonna apply. So it doesn't necessarily negate anything that's out there that's more restrictive.
Okay.
All right, okay. So the last one here is on accessory dwelling units. So the code has been updated to allow both attached and detached ADUs. Currently, only detached ADUs are allowed, but per state requirements, also attached. So think of like a basement that's converted into an ADU, or something like that, that would now be permissible. And the second bullet is really to kind of help clarify. So we've also included an ADU maximum size, so it can be either 75% of the main dwelling or 800 square feet, whichever is less. So that's to help clarify the difference between an ADU and a duplex now that you're allowing attached ADUs, so that it still is a secondary unit to the main house. It's not, oftentimes duplexes are the same size for both units, so this is ensuring that that is different than a duplex, that any sort of attached ADU or detached is a secondary unit as
And that
well.
obviously doesn't apply to a lot that's too small to accommodate it.
I would still need to meet all of the other requirements and standards that are in the code, so if it can't do that, then yeah.
Yeah, so Lydia, so it's the 75%, let me just, if I'm remembering right, that was a number that collectively we just kind of discussed and arrived on. So as we look at examples, the 800 square feet is currently in our code for that's just, because it used to be a 33% rule. And 33% of a 1,500 square foot house isn't much, and so we changed our code to just allow for 800 square foot ADUs. But now that we're allowing attached, because we're required to, what percentage of a house should be the primary living, and what percent would you consider an accessory dwelling? And trying to come up with a formula, because the bigger the house, the bigger 75% amounts to, and suddenly it's now, I'm sitting here looking at a duplex and I'm not looking at a single family and an ADU. And so that's part of the conversation of how we kind of arrived at this is, what's the typical size house that folks are building and how much is 75%? And And then there's also other criteria as well at how you access an ADU that make it different than a duplex, but.
Just want to make it clear, the 800 is a flat cap, right? So regardless of how big the main house is, the
Yeah, it's a
ADU
good
can't
point.
be over.
You're right, so I
So
misstated.
it would just be, in some cases, the ADU may need to be less than 800 if it's a small house, just to sort of maintain that. This is accessory to that small house.
But you can't have
So
like
the
a
75% number, we've used in the past, the example I often give is there's a lot of older homes and that are 1,500 square feet, 1,300, 1,200 square feet. They would still be permitted to have an ADU that's 750 square feet or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, so putting it into
There's even
context of
smaller.
our cottage home code, if you could have a cottage home on a lot, that's, the maximum size for a cottage home is 1,000 square feet.
Right.
And so if you wanted an ADU to go with that, you're looking at a 750 square foot cottage home or an ADU that would be attached, where right now under our code, if it's detached, you could do the 800 square feet. Essentially, you could have 2 cottage homes on the lot.
Still pretty good size.
Are there minimum sizes required?
No, the minimum is based on building code, and so, and that's pretty small. So the building code, they have like, I think like a bedroom has to be like 75 square feet, and so they've got different square footages for different occupancy space within a house. So when you add those all together, essentially you could have a couple hundred square feet, and that is a dwelling unit. And so, but the building code dictates that based on minimum sizes that's required for a certain space. And it's usually based on a safety requirement of some sort.
Is this where they mention an interior ADU? What is
Yeah.
that?
That's the attached.
It's like a basement.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a term used to just, like, if it's, the state requires you to allow, I think it's, the specific phrasing is attached, interior, or detached, and so the interior would be like more the case if you were to convert an interior space that's already there, which would make it most of the time your basement,
Well, we have one more, it's just
into a dwelling unit, which would be.
Oh, okay.
That you then need to have, like, let's say if your basement is just a big guest room or something like that, and you have a bedroom, but you don't have a kitchen or a bathroom. Right, if you have a kitchen and a bathroom, then it could be called an ADU.
I see. Okay.
I think we're getting close on
Yeah.
time here.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we're like literally at the end.
Yeah, we are. I say there was questions, if there are any. And then lastly here is just to talk about next steps, just so you all know what's next. So after this work section, we have kind of a final round to make changes. That's gonna be based on the feedback we heard from you all tonight, as well as any final changes from Michael. And then we also have the state reviewing, just to ensure that we're also checking all the boxes and that there's just, everyone's on the same page. So that will be conducted by the end of June. And then we will be sending those final code amendments to Michael, and then he will take that through a hearing process in the future. And I'm not sure if you have an idea when that would be, or it sounds like maybe there's some other
Well,
things to discuss related to that.
if we decide collectively that, and I'll probably pose this question later outside of this meeting, but if we decide that we're just gonna tackle these recommendations and we'll deal with the other stuff at a future code amendment, then you'll likely see, or the planning commission will likely see this in August, and you'll probably see it in September. So that's the most expedited scenario, depending on when we get through the DLCD. Otherwise, it might be pushed out a month after that. So that's my hope anyway. But if we want to tackle some other things in this, then it may just be that we drag this out for a couple more months and we address those issues and then bring it forward as a package. But of the items that we've talked about tonight, the 2 biggies that I plan to do outside of this, because I don't think Jamie and Lydia should be tackling, some of our little things, but is when we talk about the neighborhood meeting and what triggers that and what size development is going to amount to that, we could have a conversation through the planning commission to come up with what does that magic number look like, and how do we address that trigger? Because that could be a fairly lengthy discussion to try to come up with example scenarios to arrive at that. And then the other one that I have is so where's it at, is the public notice distance, and how are we gonna deal with that? So that's gonna be a bigger conversation as well, because I think the notification that we have is great for 90% of the applications that we process, but there are some that even today, it'd be like, man, I wish that notice was bigger, but we can't go bigger, because we're not allowed to go bigger than what the code says, and we have to, you know, uniformly apply that. So we'll have to come up with what are triggers. If we're gonna change a number, what is the trigger that causes a greater number? And then apply that uniformly for anybody that hits that. So anyway, but those will be two things that the planning commission will see in the future, and then we'll probably fold into this. But aside from that, if we wanna do anything else, we'll have a conversation of, do we kick the can down the road and do it next time? Or
What's
do
our
we?
deadline on this for the state changes?
They literally, oh, is there, I'll let you answer that.
No, I was gonna say, there's no deadline attached to any of this legislation.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
The recourse, if
I
there
thought we were like
was.
gaming for like 2
No.
weeks from now.
Oh, you mean for our work?
Yeah,
Oh, no, this, for our work, no, it's not. We don't need to wrap up our scope of work.
by June 30th?
By June 30th, no.
Because all of my
that's-
stuff is June 30th, and I'm just sitting there thinking, man, we better hurry up and get with the program.
No, that's the typical case, but luckily this is funded differently, so we have a little bit more time,
Yeah.
which, any of these statutes, they didn't attach a deadline by which cities must comply. Sometimes they do, in these cases, they didn't. So what would happen if you didn't is just your risk of being appeal, right? So a developer could say, "Look, here's a statute, this is out of compliance, you know, you can't enforce this rule." So that's the recourse for now. But I just want to note, we do have that a little bit extra time, and so, and the legislature is still busy right now, and so I think one thing we will do is let the session conclude, and there are 2 bills that I think we should take a quick look at before we wrap up our scope of work and see if there's any final tweaks we can make to make sure it's consistent with those as well. Because while we're here, we might as well do that rather than leave you with something that you then have to update again later.
Right, and go through this process again.
Yeah, they're not super consequential bills, but there are a couple that touch on these same topics, so, yeah, bit of a moving target.
I appreciate the efforts you two have put in. This is obviously very complicated,
Yeah.
so appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
No problem,
Yeah,
yeah.
appreciate your feedback, and we've been taking notes, so we'll be sure to incorporate that into the changes. All right, thank you.
We just second what Gary said, thanks, Mike, for all your work, and I think we can adjourn.
Great, thank you.
Good work.